The Laundered Legacy.
Chapter 1. The Interrogation. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the Spartan interrogation room, a fitting backdrop for the tense exchange unfolding within its confines. Detective Jameson leaned forward, his steely gaze fixed on the fidgeting man seated across the table. "Mr. Johnson, let's start from the beginning. Where were you on the night of March 15th? Jameson's voice was level, betraying none of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Mr. Johnson wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his eyes darting around the room. I was at home just like I told you. I don't know anything about what happened to my wife." Jameson studied the suspect's body language, noting the telltale signs of deception. "Your neighbors reported seeing you leave your house around 8 p.m. that evening. Care to explain where you were going?" I went to grab a few things from the store. Milk, bread, that sort of thing." Mr. Johnson's voice wavered, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Jameson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "So you're telling me you went to the store for a late-night grocery run, but you didn't pick up any of the items you mentioned?" The silence that followed was deafening, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Mr. Johnson's gaze dropped to the table, his face flushing with shame. "Look, I know this looks bad, but I swear I had nothing to do with what happened to my wife. I loved her, Detective. You have to believe me," he pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. Jameson remained unmoved, his eyes narrowing as he studied the suspect's every twitch and tremor. "If that's true, then why don't you tell me what you do know about your wife's activities? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're hiding something." Just then the door burst open, and a young woman strode into the room, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and determination. "Dad, you have to tell them the truth," Emily Johnson cried, her voice shaking. "Mom was involved in something illegal, and I know you knew about it." Mr. Johnson's face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. "Emily, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're dash." "Don't lie to me," Emily interrupted, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "I found the emails, the bank statements, everything. You and Mom were laundering money, weren't you?" Jameson raised a hand, silencing Mr. Johnson before he could respond. "Miss Johnson, please have a seat. I think it's time we all got the full story." Emily hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting between her father and the detective. With a deep breath, she pulled out a chair and sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. "All right, Mr. Johnson," Jameson began, his voice stern but tinged with a hint of empathy. "It's time you came clean. What really happened to your wife? And what were the two of you involved in?" The once proud man slumped in his chair, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his secrets. "It's true," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Your mother and we were in over our heads. We started small, just moving a little bit of cash around, but it escalated. We got involved with some bad people and then she..." His voice trailed off, and Jameson watched as the man's composure crumbled, replaced by a raw, soul-crushing grief. Emily reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it on her father's. "Dad, please, I need to know what happened. I deserve the truth." Mr. Johnson lifted his head, his eyes glistening with tears. "She tried to get out, Emily. She wanted to come clean to make it right. But they found out. They came after her, and I couldn't protect her." The room fell silent, save for the muffled sobs that escaped Mr. Johnson's lips. Jameson felt a pang of sympathy for the man, but he knew he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry for your loss, but I need you to tell me everything you know about this money laundering operation, and who was involved. The more you cooperate, the better chance you have of avoiding serious charges." Mr. Johnson looked up, his face etched with a mixture of resignation and fear. I don't know all the details, Detective. Your mother and I. We just did what they told us to do. We moved the money, hid the cash, created the shell companies. We had no idea how deep it all went. Emily's eyes widened, her voice trembling as she spoke. They. Who are they, Dad? Who did you get involved with? Jameson leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. That's what we need to find out, Miss Johnson. And I have a feeling your father's the key to unraveling this whole mess. Mr. Johnson's shoulders slumped, his face etched with defeat. I don't know their names. They always used code names, never their real identities. All I know is that they were part of a larger organization, something called the Syndicate. Please, you have to help me. I can't lose my daughter too. Jameson nodded, his expression grim. We'll do what we can, Mr. Johnson. But you need to understand you're in deep, and the only way out is to cooperate fully. No more lies, no more secrets. The truth is the only thing that can save you now. As the gravity of the situation sank in, the three figures in the interrogation room fell silent, the weight of their choices and the consequences they now faced hanging thick in the air. Chapter 2. A Daughter's Revelation. The silence that hung heavy in the interrogation room was shattered by the sound of Emily Johnson's trembling voice. Dad, how could you and Mom do this? She asked, her gaze pleading for answers. I thought we were a normal family. How could you get involved with these people? Mr. Johnson gazed back at his daughter, his eyes filled with a mix of remorse and fear. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Emily. Your mother and I, we just got in over our heads. We thought we could make a quick buck, provide a better life for you. But then it all spiraled out of control. Detective Jameson leaned forward, his brow furrowed with a mixture of empathy and determination. Mr. Johnson, I understand this is difficult, but I need you to walk me through everything. From the beginning, if you will. With a deep, shuddering breath, Mr. Johnson began to speak. It started small, just a few cash deposits here and there, nothing that raised any red flags. Your mother, she had a knack for numbers, and she knew how to make it all look legitimate on paper. We thought we were being so careful, so smart. Emily watched her father, her expression a mix of disbelief and betrayal. But how did you get involved with this syndicate you mentioned? What did they have to do with it? They approached us, Mr. Johnson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Said they could help us expand our little operation, make it even more profitable. At first we were hesitant, but the money they were offering, it was too good to pass up. Jameson's eyes narrowed as he scribbled notes in his pad. And what exactly did they have you do? What was your role in this money laundering scheme? We opened shell companies, offshore accounts, the whole 9 yards, Mr. Johnson replied, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his confession. They'd give us cash, and we'd filter it through the system, making it look like legitimate business transactions. He paused, his gaze falling to the table. That's where your mother came in. She was the one who really knew how to manipulate the books, make it all look clean. Emily's brow furrowed as she processed her father's words. But if you were just following their instructions, how did it all go so wrong? What happened to Mom? Mr. Johnson's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She wanted out, Emily. She couldn't live with the guilt anymore. She was going to go to the authorities, come clean about everything. But the syndicate, they found out. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. They came for her, and I couldn't stop them. Jameson watched the exchange, his expression grave. Mr. Johnson, I need you to be completely honest with me. What happened the night your wife was killed? The older man's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. I came home and she was already gone. There was blood, so much blood. I panicked, I didn't know what to do. I cleaned up the best I could and tried to cover my tracks. Emily's eyes widened in horror, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God, Dad. You didn't try to hide what happened, did you? Mr. Johnson shook his head, his shoulders shaking with sobs. I'm so sorry, Emily. I was scared, I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted to protect you, to keep you safe from all of this. He looked up, his gaze pleading. Please, you have to believe me. I loved your mother more than anything. I never wanted this to happen. Jameson's expression remained impassive, his mind racing as he pieced together the fragments of the story. Mr. Johnson, I understand you were trying to protect your daughter, but hiding evidence of a crime is itself a crime. You realize that, don't you? Mr. Johnson nodded, his face etched with resignation. I know, Detective. I know I've made a terrible mistake. But please, you have to help me. I can't lose Emily too. She's all I have left. Jameson held up a hand, silencing the man. I'm going to need you to tell me everything, Mr. Johnson. Every detail, no matter how small. The more you cooperate, the better chance you have of avoiding more serious charges. Emily sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling from the revelations. She had always known her family was a little different, a little more affluent than their neighbors, but she had never imagined the truth would be this dark, this twisted. Dad, how could you? She whispered, her voice laced with betrayal and heartbreak. Mom is gone, and now you're telling me you tried to cover it up? How am I supposed to trust anything you say? Mr. Johnson reached across the table, his hand trembling. Emily, please, you have to understand. I was scared, I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to keep you safe, to give you the life your mother and I always dreamed of for you. Emily pulled her hand away, her eyes narrowing. That's not good enough, Dad. Nothing you say can excuse what you and Mom did or what happened to her. I want the truth, all of it. No more lies, no more secrets. Jameson cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the two distraught figures. Miss Johnson, I know this is a lot to process, but your father's cooperation is key to unraveling this entire case. If you can help us understand what you know, it could make all the difference. Emily's gaze flicked to the detective, her expression torn. I don't know much, Detective. I only discovered the truth a few days ago, when I was going through Mom's things. That's when I found the emails, the bank statements, all of it. She paused, her brow furrowing in concentration. I remember Mom talking on the phone sometimes, using strange code words. And there were always these mysterious deliveries, packages that would show up at the house late at night. Jameson leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. Can you remember any of the code words or details about these deliveries? Emily shook her head, her frustration evident. I'm sorry, Detective. I was just a kid back then, I didn't think anything of it. I wish I could be more helpful, but all I know is that my parents were involved in something terrible, and it cost my mother her life. Jameson nodded, his expression somber. I understand, Miss Johnson, but any information you can provide, no matter how small, could be crucial to unraveling this case. We need to find out who was responsible for your mother's death, and put a stop to this money laundering operation once and for all. The room fell silent, save for the muffled sobs of Mr. Johnson and the sound of Jameson's pen scratching against the notepad. As the weight of the revelations settled, a sense of grim determination took hold. This was no longer just a case. It was a fight for justice, a battle to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to account. Chapter 3. Following the money trail. Jameson's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table as he studied the files sprawled out before him. Bank statements, offshore account records, and reams of financial data. The evidence was mounting, but the connections remained elusive. All right, people, let's go through this again, he announced, drawing the attention of the detective team huddled around the conference table. What do we know so far about the syndicate and their money laundering operation? Detective Harris cleared his throat, his brow furrowed in concentration. Well, based on the information provided by Mr. Johnson, it seems the syndicate is a larger criminal organization that recruited the Johnsons to help move their illicit funds. They'd give the Johnsons cash, which they'd then filter through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts to make it appear legitimate. Jameson nodded, jotting down a few notes. And what about the specifics? Do we have any leads on the syndicate's inner workings or the identities of the individuals involved? Detective Alvarez spoke up, her expression grim. That's where it gets a little trickier. Mr. Johnson claims the syndicate members always used code names, never revealing their real identities. And the paper trail we've uncovered so far is deliberately convoluted, designed to obscure the true source of the funds. Jameson let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his graying hair. So we're looking at a well-organized, sophisticated money laundering operation, with a secretive criminal organization calling the shots. Wonderful. He leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. All right, let's start with what we do know. We've traced the bulk of the money flow to a shell company called Acme Enterprises. What can you tell me about that? Detective Harris stepped forward, shuffling through the papers in front of him. Acme Enterprises is registered to a P.O. box in a low-income neighborhood, with no physical business address. The company's books show a variety of legitimate-sounding transactions, but our forensic accountants have identified dozens of suspicious cash deposits and withdrawals. Jameson nodded, his expression grim. And what about the bank accounts linked to Acme? Have we been able to trace those as well? That's where it gets really interesting, Alvarez chimed in, her eyes gleaming with a hint of triumph. The Acme Enterprises accounts are connected to a network of offshore shell companies, with bank accounts spread across the Caribbean and Central America. It's a veritable maze of financial obfuscation. Jameson leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. So we've got a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and mysterious cash flows. Sounds like the syndicate knew what they were doing when they recruited the Johnsons. Have we been able to make any headway in tracing the origin of these funds? Harris shook his head, his expression rueful. Not yet, boss. Our forensic accountants have been poring over the records, but the trail keeps leading to dead ends. It's like trying to follow a ghost through a labyrinth. Jameson drummed his fingers on the table, his brow furrowed in thought. All right, then let's change tactics. If we can't follow the money, let's try following the people. Have we been able to identify any of the syndicate members, even through their code names? Alvarez nodded, her expression grim. We've got a few leads there, but nothing concrete yet. Based on the information Mr. Johnson provided, we know they used code names like the broker and the fixer when dealing with the Johnsons. We've cross-referenced those names with our databases, but so far nothing's panned out. Jameson let out a frustrated sigh. Damn it. These people are good, I'll give them that. All right, here's what I want you to do. Harris, I need you to dig deeper into the Acme Enterprises accounts. See if you can find any anomalies or inconsistencies that might give us a lead. Alvarez, I want you to go back to the Johnsons. See if you can get any more information out of them. Even the smallest detail could be a breakthrough. The two detectives nodded, already moving to gather their files. Jameson watched them, his expression pensive. And what about you, boss? Alvarez asked, pausing at the door. Jameson's lips thinned into a determined line. I'm going to pay a visit to our friends at the Financial Crimes Unit. If anyone can help us navigate this maze of offshore accounts and shell companies, it's them. Alvarez nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Sounds like a plan. We'll keep you posted on our end. As the detectives filed out of the room, Jameson turned his attention back to the stack of files, his mind racing. This case was proving to be a formidable challenge, but he was determined to see it through. Too many lives had been destroyed by the syndicate's ruthless operations, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. With a deep breath, he gathered the files and made his way to the Financial Crimes Unit, his steps filled with a newfound sense of purpose. The fluorescent lights of the Financial Crimes Unit cast an eerie glow over the bustling workspace, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere of the interrogation room. Jameson strode through the maze of cubicles, his eyes scanning the room for a familiar face. Jameson, my man, what brings you to our neck of the woods? A voice called out, and Jameson turned to see a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a warm smile. Jake, good to see you, Jameson replied, shaking the other man's hand. I'm in the middle of a rather complex case, and I was hoping you and your team could lend me a hand. Jake's expression sobered, and he gestured for Jameson to follow him into a nearby conference room. All right, hit me with the details. What kind of financial shenanigans are we talking about here? Jameson laid out the case, from the Johnsons' involvement in the money laundering operation to the syndicate's intricate web of shell companies and offshore accounts. As he spoke, Jake's brow furrowed, his fingers drumming on the tabletop. Damn, Jameson, this is some heavy stuff. The syndicate, huh? I've heard whispers about them, but nothing concrete. They're a slippery bunch, that's for sure. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. All right, let's see what we can do. We'll start by taking a deep dive into those Acme Enterprises accounts, see if we can't uncover some weak spots in their financial fortress. Then we'll see if we can't trace those offshore shell companies back to their source. Jameson nodded, relief washing over him. I was hoping you'd say that. I've got my team working on it from their end, but I figured a little extra firepower from your unit couldn't hurt. Jake grinned, his eyes gleaming with determination. You know it, partner. We're gonna get to the bottom of this, no matter how deep the rabbit hole goes. As the two men bent over the files, poring over the tangled web of financial records, a glimmer of hope began to take root. This case might be a daunting challenge, but with the combined expertise of Jameson's team and the Financial Crimes Unit, they just might have a shot at unraveling the syndicate's dark secrets. Chapter 4. Family Secrets Unraveled. The oppressive silence that had fallen over the interrogation room was shattered when Jameson once again confronted Mr. Johnson, armed with the new information uncovered by his team. All right, Mr. Johnson, let's go back to the night your wife was killed. I need you to walk me through everything, and this time I want the complete, unvarnished truth. Jameson's voice was stern, leaving no room for evasion. Mr. Johnson's shoulders sagged, the weight of his secrets etched into every line of his face. I told you what happened. I came home and she was already gone. There was blood everywhere and I panicked. I just wanted to protect Emily, to keep her safe. Jameson leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. That's not the full story, is it, Mr. Johnson? Our investigation has uncovered some new details, and I think it's time you came clean. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between her father and the detective. Dad, please. No more lies, no more secrets. I need to know what really happened to Mom. Mr. Johnson's hands trembled as he clasped them on the table, his eyes downcast. All right, I'll tell you everything. But you have to understand, I was scared, I didn't know what else to do. He took a deep, shuddering breath before continuing. The night your mother was killed, I came home to find her on the floor, bleeding. She was already gone. But I couldn't call the police. I couldn't risk Emily finding out the truth about what we'd done. Emily's eyes widened in horror, her voice barely above a whisper. So you just covered it up. You lied to the police, to me. Mr. Johnson nodded, his face etched with shame. I cleaned up the best I could, trying to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. I knew the syndicate was behind it, that they'd come for us if I didn't keep quiet. I couldn't lose you too, Emily. Jameson's brow furrowed as he scribbled furious notes. And what about the money, Mr. Johnson? What happened to the cash and accounts you were using for the money laundering operation? I tried to hide it all to cover my tracks, Mr. Johnson admitted, his voice wavering. I stashed the cash in various locations, closed down the offshore accounts, and destroyed as much evidence as I could. I thought if I could just make it all disappear, maybe Emily and I could start over, escape it all. Emily shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and betrayal. But you didn't, did you? That's why I found those emails and bank statements, isn't it? You couldn't just let it go. Mr. Johnson's gaze met his daughter's, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm so sorry, Emily. I was terrified, I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted to protect you, to give you the life your mother and I always dreamed of. Jameson cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the two distraught figures. Mr. Johnson, I understand you were trying to protect your daughter, but covering up a crime is still a crime. The more you cooperate with us, the better chance you have of avoiding more serious charges. Mr. Johnson nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. I know, Detective. I know I've made a terrible mistake, and I have to live with the consequences. But please, you have to help me. I can't lose Emily too. She's all I have left." Jameson's expression softened, a glimmer of empathy shining through. "I'll do what I can, Mr. Johnson, but you have to be completely honest with me. What else do you know about the syndicate and their involvement in your wife's death?" Mr. Johnson's gaze darted around the room, as if he expected the shadowy figures of the syndicate to materialize at any moment. They were ruthless, Detective. When my wife tried to back out to come clean, they came after her. I don't know all the details, but I know they have people everywhere, watching, waiting." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They warned me that if I so much as breathed a word about what we were doing, they'd come for Emily next. I couldn't risk it, I had to protect her at all costs." Jameson's brow furrowed as he processed the new information. "So you're telling me the syndicate has been keeping tabs on you and your family this whole time? That they're the ones who killed your wife?" Mr. Johnson nodded, his face etched with anguish. "Yes, Detective. They're the ones who did it. And I've been living in fear of them ever since, afraid that they might come after Emily too." Emily's hands trembled as she reached across the table, grasping her father's. "Dad, why didn't you just come clean? Why did you keep all of this a secret?" Mr. Johnson's expression crumpled, the weight of his choices finally breaking through his facade of composure. "I was so afraid, Emily. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too. I thought if I just played along, if I kept everything hidden, maybe we could escape it all. But I was a fool, and now your mother is gone because of my cowardice." Jameson's gaze softened as he watched the exchange, the gravity of the situation settling over the room like a heavy shroud. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you were trying to protect your daughter, but the best thing you can do now is cooperate fully. We need to find a way to bring the syndicate down, to get justice for your wife." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll tell you everything I know, Detective. No more secrets, no more lies. I've already lost too much. I can't let them take my daughter too." Jameson leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he processed the new revelations. The syndicate was clearly a formidable adversary, with its tentacles reaching deep into the fabric of society. But with Mr. Johnson's cooperation and the information they had already uncovered, they might just have a chance at unraveling this twisted web of deceit and corruption. He turned to Emily, his expression grave. "Miss Johnson, I know this is a lot to take in, but I need you to think carefully. Anything you can remember about your mother's interactions with these syndicate members, any details at all, could be crucial to this investigation." Emily's brow furrowed in concentration, her mind searching for any shred of information that could help them. Well, there were those strange phone calls, the ones where Mom would use all those code words. And those late-night deliveries, the ones that would show up when Dad wasn't home. She paused, her gaze shifting to her father. "Dad, what were those packages? What were they for?" Mr. Johnson's face paled, his hand trembling as he reached into his pocket. I've been holding on to something your mother left behind. I was afraid to turn it over, afraid of what might happen, but now I know I have to." He withdrew a small worn envelope, its edges frayed and discolored. "Your mother, she left this for me the night before she died. She said if anything ever happened to her, I was to give it to you." Emily's fingers trembled as she took the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it, Dad? What did Mom leave for me?" Mr. Johnson's expression was one of sorrow and regret. "I don't know, Emily. But whatever it is, it might be the key to unraveling this whole mess. Your mother, she was trying to make things right to protect you. Please, you have to find out what's inside." As Emily carefully opened the envelope, Jameson leaned forward, his gaze intense. This might be the break they needed, the glimmer of hope they had been searching for. With a deep breath, he prepared to dive deeper into the tangled web of the syndicate's secrets, determined to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. Chapter 5. The Wider Web. The tattered envelope felt heavy in Emily's trembling hands, its worn edges a testament to the secrets it held. As she carefully pulled the flap open, she could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the anticipation and dread mingling in the pit of her stomach. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, its surface stained and crinkled. Unfolding it with great care, her eyes scanned the hurried, scrawled handwriting. A message from her mother, a desperate plea for help. "Emily, my darling, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. Your father and we've made a terrible mistake, one that has put our family in grave danger. I know you must be confused, hurt, and angry. Believe me, I never wanted any of this. We were just trying to make a better life for you, to give you the opportunities we never had. But then it all spiraled out of control, and now I fear the consequences may be too great to bear. There's a criminal organization, a syndicate, that has been pulling the strings all along. They approached us, promised riches beyond our wildest dreams if we would help them launder their money. We were foolish, greedy, and it cost me everything. They've been watching us, Emily, ever since we got involved. And now, I'm afraid they know I'm planning to come clean, to turn myself in and try to make things right. If anything happens to me, I need you to know the truth. I've hidden away some evidence, a trail that might lead you to the heart of their operation. It's stashed in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank, under the name Elizabeth Ryder. The key is tucked away in my jewelry box, the one I know you always loved. Please, my darling, you have to get that evidence and take it to the police. Detective Jameson, he's a good man and he can help you. He can bring down the syndicate and make them pay for what they've done. I'm so sorry, Emily. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to give you the world, but instead I've condemned our family to this nightmare. Please forgive me. And know that I love you with all my heart." As the final words trailed off, Emily's vision blurred with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter to her chest. She had always known her family was different, that there were secrets they kept hidden, but she had never imagined the truth would be this dark, this twisted. Jameson watched the young woman, his expression somber. "Miss Johnson, I know this is a lot to take in, but we need to act quickly. Do you have any idea where this safety deposit box might be located?" Emily nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Detective. Mom always kept the key to her jewelry box in the top drawer of her dresser. Hey, I'll go get it right away." As Emily hurried from the room, Jameson turned his attention to Mr. Johnson, his gaze unwavering. "All right, Mr. Johnson, it's time you told me everything you know about this syndicate operation. No more secrets, no more lies. The lives of your wife and daughter are at stake here." Mr. Johnson's shoulders sagged, the weight of his choices etched into every line of his face. I don't know much, Detective. Your mother and we were just pawns in their game. They gave us the cash, told us where to deposit it, and we did as we were told. We had no idea how far-reaching their operation was." Jameson's brow furrowed as he scribbled furious notes. "But surely you must know something, anything that could help us get to the bottom of this. Where did the cash come from? Who were the individuals you were in contact with?" Mr. Johnson shook his head, his gaze downcast. "I'm sorry, Detective, but I really don't know. The syndicate members always used code names, never their real identities. And the cash, well, it came from all over: drug deals, human trafficking, extortion, you name it. They were running a massive criminal enterprise, and we were just a small cog in the machine." Jameson let out a frustrated sigh, his fingers drumming on the tabletop. "So you're telling me you have no idea who's behind this? No names, no locations, nothing?" Mr. Johnson's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Detective. I wish I could be more helpful, but the truth is I was terrified. They threatened Emily, threatened to take her away from me if I ever breathed a word. I couldn't risk it, I had to protect her at all costs. Jameson's expression softened, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. I know, Mr. Johnson. You were just trying to keep your family safe, but now the stakes are even higher. We need to find a way to take down this syndicate before they can get to you or your daughter. Just then the door burst open, and Emily rushed back into the room, the small ornate key clutched tightly in her hand. I've got it, Detective. The key to the safety deposit box. Jameson nodded, his expression grim. All right, let's go. Time is of the essence here. Mr. Johnson, I need you to stay here and continue answering our questions. We'll be back as soon as we can. As Jameson and Emily hurried out of the interrogation room, the weight of the revelations hung heavy in the air. The syndicate's reach was far-reaching, its tentacles stretching across the city, ensnaring innocent lives in its web of deceit and corruption. The short drive to the bank was filled with a tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional sniffle from Emily as she struggled to compose herself. Jameson's mind raced, his thoughts jumping from one scenario to the next, each one more dire than the last. Detective, do you really think this evidence can help us take down the syndicate? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Jameson's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his expression resolute. I certainly hope so, Miss Johnson. Your mother seems to have left us a breadcrumb trail, one that might just lead us to the heart of this criminal organization. But I need you to be prepared for anything. These people, they're not going to go down without a fight. Emily swallowed hard, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I don't care, Detective. They took my mother from me, and I won't rest until they pay for what they've done. Whatever it takes, I'm in. Jameson nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. I admire your courage, Miss Johnson, but I need you to promise me one thing. You'll let me and my team handle this. These syndicate members are dangerous, and I can't risk you getting caught in the crossfire. Emily's brow furrowed, her gaze defiant. I can't just sit back and do nothing, Detective. This is my family we're talking about. I want to help, I need to be a part of this. Jameson sighed, his expression conflicted. I understand, Emily, I really do. But the best thing you can do is let us do our jobs. We'll get Chapter 6. Courtroom Drama. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the trial against Mr. Johnson began. Jameson had worked tirelessly with his team, combing through the evidence uncovered from the safety deposit box and piecing together the complex web of the syndicate's criminal empire. Now, it was time to present their case and bring the Johnsons' tormentors to justice. Emily sat in the gallery, her hands trembling as she watched her father take the stand. Despite the gravity of the situation, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope that the truth would finally be revealed, that her mother's memory would be honored. Prosecutor Liliana Gutierrez rose from her seat, her expression stern as she approached the witness stand. Mr. Johnson, can you please state your full name and occupation for the record? Mr. Johnson's voice wavered as he responded. My name is Thomas Johnson, and I'm currently unemployed. Gutierrez nodded, her gaze unwavering. Mr. Johnson, you are on trial for your involvement in a money laundering operation connected to a criminal organization known as the Syndicate. Is that correct? Mr. Johnson swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. Yes, that's correct. My wife and we got involved with them, and it cost my wife her life. Gutierrez's brow furrowed, her tone accusatory. And you're admitting to your role in this illegal activity, correct? You helped the syndicate launder their illicit funds through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Mr. Johnson nodded, his shoulders sagging. Yes, I did. I was scared, I didn't know what else to do. They threatened my daughter, and I couldn't risk losing her too. Gutierrez's expression softened ever so slightly. I understand your motivation, Mr. Johnson, but the law is clear. Regardless of the circumstances, your actions were still illegal. Now, can you tell the court what happened the night your wife was killed? Mr. Johnson's face crumpled, and he wiped at his eyes with a trembling hand. I came home and found her on the floor, bleeding. She was already gone, and I panicked. I tried to cover it up to make it look like a robbery, but it was the syndicate. They killed her because she wanted to come clean, to turn us all in. Gutierrez nodded, her tone measured. And what happened to the evidence and cash you were using for the money laundering operation? Where did you hide it? I stashed the cash in various locations, and I tried to destroy as much evidence as I could, Mr. Johnson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I was so afraid, I just wanted to protect my daughter. I never meant for any of this to happen. Gutierrez turned to the jury, her expression grave. The prosecution will show that Mr. Johnson's actions were not those of a concerned father, but rather those of a man deeply entangled in a criminal enterprise. His attempts to cover up his wife's murder and hide the evidence only further implicate him in the syndicate's illicit activities. She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. However, we will also demonstrate that Mr. Johnson was not the mastermind behind this operation, but rather a pawn in a much larger and more sinister scheme. The true architects of this money laundering conspiracy are the members of the syndicate, and we intend to bring them to justice as well. Jameson watched from the gallery, his expression tense as he waited for the defense to take the stand. He knew that the case rested on the evidence uncovered from the safety deposit box, the breadcrumb trail left by Mrs. Johnson in the hopes of exposing the syndicate's reach. As the defense attorney rose to cross-examine Mr. Johnson, Jameson leaned forward. His eyes narrowed in concentration. This was the moment of truth, the pivotal point where the fate of the Johnson family would be decided. The defense attorney, a seasoned veteran with a reputation for shrewd tactics, approached the witness stand with a measured, almost sympathetic gaze. Mr. Johnson, I understand that you were in a difficult position, caught between the demands of a dangerous criminal organization and the need to protect your family. Can you tell the court why you chose to cover up your wife's murder? Mr. Johnson's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the witness stand. I was terrified. The syndicate, they threatened to come after my daughter if I didn't cooperate. I couldn't risk losing Emily too, not after they took my wife from me. The defense attorney nodded, his expression softening. And can you explain to the court the nature of your involvement with the syndicate? What were you and your wife tasked with doing? We were used to launder their money, Mr. Johnson admitted, his voice quivering. They would give us cash, and we'd filter it through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts to make it look legitimate. We had no idea how deep their operation went, or how powerful they were. The defense attorney paced the floor, his brow furrowed in contemplation. So you're saying that you and your wife were simply following the syndicate's instructions, without fully understanding the scope of their criminal activities? Mr. Johnson nodded, his gaze downcast. Yes, that's right. We were in over our heads, and we didn't know how to get out. I just wanted to protect my daughter, to give her the life her mother and I had always dreamed of. The defense attorney turned to the jury, his expression earnest. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to consider the testimony you've heard today. Mr. Johnson was not the architect of this criminal enterprise, but rather a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a much larger game. He made mistakes, yes, but he did so out of a desperate attempt to shield his only remaining family member from harm." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. The true culprits in this case are the members of the syndicate, the shadowy figures who manipulated the Johnsons and countless others for their own nefarious purposes. Mr. Johnson may have broken the law, but he did so under duress, and he is now trying to make amends for his actions by cooperating with the authorities. Jameson's brow furrowed as he listened to the defense attorney's arguments, his mind racing. He knew that the evidence they had uncovered was damning, but the defense was making a compelling case for leniency. The fate of the Johnson family now rested in the hands of the jury, and Jameson could only hope that they would see the truth behind the web of deceit. As the cross-examination continued, Jameson's gaze shifted to Emily, who sat watching the proceedings with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He knew that the outcome of this trial would have a profound impact on her life, and he was determined to do everything in his power to ensure that justice was served. With a deep breath, Jameson steeled himself for the next phase of the trial, where he and his team would present the evidence uncovered from the safety deposit box. This was their chance to unravel the syndicate's operations and hold the true culprits accountable. The stakes had never been higher, and Jameson was prepared to fight tooth and nail to bring down the criminal organization that had torn the Johnson family apart. Chapter 7. The Verdict and Aftermath. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury filed back into the room, their faces impassive. Jameson sat on the edge of his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of months of arduous investigation and dogged determination. As the judge asked the foreman to deliver the verdict, the silence in the room was deafening. Jameson glanced over at Emily, who sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a mix of trepidation and resolve. "On the charges of money laundering and obstruction of justice, we, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Johnson, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Jameson watched as Mr. Johnson's shoulders sagged, the weight of the verdict etched into every line of his face. Beside him, Emily's eyes widened, her lips parting in a silent cry. But the foreman was not finished. "However, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of murmurs and whispers, as Jameson's mind raced to process the implications of the verdict. Not guilty on the murder charge. How could that be, when the evidence they had uncovered clearly implicated the syndicate in Mrs. Johnson's death? Jameson's gaze shifted to the prosecution team, where Gutierrez stood with a mix of confusion and frustration on her face. Clearly, she had not anticipated this outcome either. As the judge called for order, Jameson leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This doesn't make any sense," he whispered to Emily, who sat beside him, her expression a mirror of his own. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They must have found something, some piece of evidence that we missed. But how could they not convict him for Mom's murder?" Jameson shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know, Emily. But I can assure you we're going to get to the bottom of this. This isn't over, not by a long shot." As the judge passed down the sentence, 5 years in prison for the money laundering charges, with the possibility of parole after 3, Jameson watched as Mr. Johnson was led away, his face etched with a mixture of resignation and relief. The man had clearly been through a living hell, and Jameson couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for him, despite the gravity of his crimes. Once the courtroom had cleared, Jameson approached Gutierrez, his expression grim. "All right, Liliana, what the hell happened in there? How could the jury acquit him on the murder charge?" Gutierrez let out a frustrated sigh, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I wish I knew, Jameson. We had a solid case. The evidence from the safety deposit box was damning. But somehow, the defense managed to sow enough reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds. Jameson's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Reasonable doubt. After everything we uncovered, how could they possibly still have doubts? Gutters shook her head, her expression grim. I'm not sure, but my guess is that the defense was able to capitalize on the emotional appeal of Mr. Johnson's testimony. They painted him as a victim, a pawn in the syndicate's twisted game, and somehow the jury bought it. Jameson let out a frustrated growl, running a hand through his graying hair. Damn it, Liliana. We were so close to bringing the entire syndicate down, and now this. What the hell are we supposed to do? Gutierrez placed a reassuring hand on Jameson's arm, her gaze sympathetic. I know, Jameson. I'm just as frustrated as you are. But we can't give up, not now. We have to keep digging, keep following the trail. There has to be something we're missing, some piece of the puzzle that the jury didn't see. Jameson nodded, his expression resolute. You're right. This isn't over, not by a long shot. I'm gonna go talk to Emily, see if she has any insights or ideas. Maybe together, we can find a way to unravel this mess once and for all. As Jameson approached Emily, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow for the young woman. She had been through so much, and now it seemed like the justice she had so desperately sought was just out of reach. Emily, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice heavy with empathy. I know this can't be easy for you, but I need your help. There has to be something we're missing, some piece of the puzzle that could turn this whole case around. Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her expression was one of steely determination. I'm not giving up, Detective. Not after everything my family has been through. If there's a way to bring down the syndicate, we'll find it. I owe it to my mother to see this through. Jameson nodded, a glimmer of hope sparking in his chest. All right, then let's get to work. We've come too far to let this slip through our fingers. Tell me, is there anything from the safety deposit box that we might have overlooked? Emily's brow furrowed as she delved into her memories, her mind racing. Well, there was that envelope from my mother, the one with the clues about the syndicate's operations. Maybe there's something in there that we missed, some detail that could point us in the right direction. Jameson's eyes widened, and he placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, his gaze intense. That's it, Emily. Your mother was trying to help us, to give us the tools we needed to take down the syndicate. We can't give up, not now. Let's go back over that evidence, see if we can find something the jury missed. As the two of them pored over the files and documents, their determination only grew stronger. They knew that the syndicate was still out there, their tentacles reaching into every corner of the city, and they couldn't rest until the truth was finally revealed. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued to unravel the complex web of the syndicate's operations. Jameson and his team worked tirelessly, following every lead, chasing down every suspect, and slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson served out his sentence, his time in prison a stark contrast to the luxurious life he had once led. Emily visited him regularly, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and understanding. She knew that her father had made mistakes, but she also understood the fear and desperation that had driven him to make those choices. As the months passed, Jameson and his team uncovered a startling revelation. The syndicate's reach extended far beyond the Johnson family, and their criminal enterprise was even more extensive than they had initially suspected. With this new information, they were able to build a case that was impossible to ignore, and soon the wheels of justice began to turn. The trial that followed was a whirlwind of testimony, evidence, and legal maneuvering, but in the end, the syndicate's leaders were convicted on a host of charges, from money laundering to racketeering to murder. The verdict was a triumph, not just for Jameson and his team, but for the entire community that had been ravaged by the syndicate's dark shadow. As the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, Jameson caught Emily's eye, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She returned the gesture, her expression one of relief and resolution. The long, arduous journey had been worth it, and they both knew that the Johnsons' sacrifice had not been in vain. In the aftermath of the trial, Emily visited her father in prison. Her eyes filled with a newfound sense of purpose. "Dad, it's over," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The syndicate is gone, and they're never coming back. We can finally start to rebuild our lives." Mr. Johnson looked up, his expression a mix of sorrow and hope. "I'm so proud of you, Emily. You and Detective Jameson, you did what I never could. You brought them down. I just wish." His voice trailed off, and Emily reached across the table, grasping his hand. "I know, Dad. I miss her too. But we're going to be okay. We're going to make a new life, one that honors Mom's memory and everything she fought for." As they embraced, a weight seemed to lift from their shoulders, and for the first time in years, a glimmer of peace found its way into their hearts. The road ahead would not be easy, but with the syndicate's grip finally broken, the Johnsons could begin to heal, to rebuild, and to reclaim the legacy that had been stolen from them. In the days that followed, Jameson watched as Emily stepped into the spotlight, using her family's story to inspire others and raise awareness about the dangers of financial crime. Her resilience and determination were an inspiration to all who knew her, and Jameson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the young woman she had become. As for the detective himself, he knew that this case would forever leave its mark on him. The syndicate's reach had been far-reaching, their impact devastating, and he vowed to continue the fight against white-collar crime, to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same kind of heartbreak and betrayal. With a deep breath, Jameson turned his gaze to the horizon, his expression resolute. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. And as long as there were criminals like the syndicate lurking in the shadows, he would be there, ready to uncover the truth and bring them to justice. Chapter 8. Unfinished Business. Months had passed since the trial that brought down the syndicate, but the ripple effects of their crimes continued to be felt. For Detective Jameson, the case had left an indelible mark, a constant reminder that the battle against white-collar corruption was far from over. As he sat at his desk, sifting through the latest batch of financial records, his brow furrowed in concentration. The syndicate might have been dismantled, their leaders serving lengthy prison sentences, but Jameson knew that their tentacles had reached far and wide. There were still loose ends to tie up, connections to uncover, and the nagging feeling that the true extent of their criminal enterprise had yet to be fully revealed. A soft knock on his office door jolted him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Emily Johnson standing in the doorway, a solemn expression on her face. "Detective Jameson," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Do you have a moment? There's something I need to discuss with you." Jameson gestured to the chair in front of his desk, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Of course, Emily. Come in, have a seat. What's on your mind?" Emily slid into the chair, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "It's been a few months since the trial and I can't stop thinking about it all. About the syndicate, about my parents, about everything that happened." Jameson nodded, his expression empathetic. "I can only imagine how difficult this must be for you. Losing a parent is never easy, and the circumstances surrounding your mother's death, well, they're certainly not something any child should have to endure." Emily's gaze met his, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "That's just it, Detective. I don't think my mother's death was the end of the syndicate's crimes. There's still something that's been nagging at me, something I can't quite put my finger on." Jameson leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on, Emily. What are you thinking?" "Well, during the trial, the jury seemed convinced that my father wasn't directly responsible for my mother's murder," Emily began, her brow furrowed in thought. And you and the prosecution team were just as baffled by that verdict as I was. So I've been wondering, what if there's more to the story? What if my mother was onto something? Something even bigger than the money laundering operation? Jameson's eyes widened as the implication of her words sank in. You think your mother may have been digging into the syndicate's activities, trying to uncover the full extent of their criminal network? Emily nodded, her expression earnest. Exactly. And if that's the case, then maybe her death wasn't just a warning to my father, but a way to silence her, to keep her from revealing the truth. Jameson leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. That's a compelling theory, Emily. And if it's true, then the syndicate's reach may be far more extensive than we ever imagined. He paused, his gaze narrowing. But what makes you think there's more to uncover? What have you found? Emily reached into her bag, withdrawing a thin manila envelope. I've been going through my mother's things, the ones that weren't confiscated as evidence. And I found this, a series of notes and documents that she had been compiling, all about the syndicate's operations. She handed the envelope to Jameson, who quickly began to flip through the contents, his eyes widening with each passing page. This is incredible, Emily. Your mother was building a case against the syndicate, and it looks like she may have been on the verge of something big. Jameson's fingers traced the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. She was tracking the flow of money, mapping out the network of shell companies and offshore accounts. And here, he paused, his gaze sharpening. It looks like she had identified a key figure in the syndicate's hierarchy, someone she believed was the mastermind behind the entire operation. Emily leaned forward, her expression intense. Who is it, detective? What did she find? Jameson's jaw tightened, his expression grim. According to these notes, your mother believed the syndicate's true leader was a man named Alexander Maynard. He's a prominent businessman in the city, with his fingers in all sorts of financial ventures. But if your mother's research is accurate, he's been using those businesses as a front for the syndicate's money laundering and other criminal activities. Emily's eyes widened, her hands clenching into fists. Alexander Maynard. I know that name. He was one of the people who testified at the trial, claiming he had no knowledge of the syndicate's activities. But if my mother was right, then he was lying through his teeth. Jameson nodded, his expression resolute. Exactly. And if this is true, then the syndicate's reach is even more far-reaching than we ever imagined. Maynard is a respected member of the community, someone with significant political and financial influence. Taking him down could unravel an entire web of corruption. Emily's gaze hardened, a familiar determination flickering in her eyes. Then that's what we have to do, detective. We have to finish what my mother started, and bring down the rest of the syndicate's empire. For her, and for everyone else they've hurt. Jameson reached across the desk, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's arm. I understand, Emily. But you have to understand the risks involved. Maynard is a powerful man, and the syndicate has proven they're willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their operation. I can't in good conscience put you in harm's way. Emily's expression didn't waver, her resolve unwavering. I appreciate your concern, detective, but this isn't just about me anymore. This is about justice. About making sure the syndicate can never hurt another family the way they hurt mine. I'm in this for the long haul, and I'm not backing down. Jameson sighed, his gaze resigned. I knew you were going to say that. All right, Emily, we'll do this together. But I want you to promise me that you'll follow my lead no matter what. This is a dangerous game we're playing, and I can't afford to lose you too. Emily's lips curled into a small, determined smile. You have my word, detective. And thank you for everything you've done for my family, and for being willing to see this through to the end. Jameson nodded, a glimmer of hope sparking in his chest. All right, then let's get to work. The syndicate may have thought they'd won, but they were wrong. This fight is far from over. As the two of them pored over the evidence, mapping out their next steps, Jameson couldn't help but feel a sense of renewed purpose. The syndicate had taken so much from the Johnson family, but now they had a chance to reclaim what was stolen, to uncover the full extent of the organization's crimes, and to bring those responsible to justice. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but Jameson was more determined than ever to see this through. The syndicate's reign of terror had to end, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that happened, even if it meant putting his own career on the line. With a deep breath, Jameson turned his attention back to the task at hand, his mind racing with possibilities and strategies. The syndicate's days were numbered, and he was determined to make sure they paid for the devastation they had wrought. This was unfinished business, and he wasn't about to let it rest until the final chapter had been written.